The UN estimates that around 735 million people are currently facing hunger. Before Russia's full-scale invasion, Ukraine was one of the main suppliers of grain to the World Food Programme, which provides food to countries in need. This is an extremely important mission for Ukraine, not least because Ukrainians know all too well what it's like to face famine. In 1932-1933, the Soviet authorities orchestrated a genocide through artificial famine in Ukraine, also known as the Holodomor. The Holodomor claimed the lives of approximately 3.9 million Ukrainians. However, when considering the 600,000 unborn children, the total loss is estimated at 4.5 million people. It was nothing but the deliberate mass murder of Ukrainians. Let's find out why. In the late 1920s, the authorities sought to transform the USSR into industrial economy. You need a lot of money to make this idea a reality, and one of the main sources of currency for the USSR at the time was grain exports. Ukraine has a significant concentration of fertile land. In the 1930s, however, this land was privately owned and farmed by Ukrainian peasants, who grew and sold their own crops. The Soviet authorities were unhappy with this dependency. Their response was a policy of collectivization. The idea of collectivization was to take the private land of individual farmers and turn it into state-owned farms with collective labor. Peasants who did not want to become part of the collective farms were branded as enemies. Many were deported to the north, the Urals and Siberia. Their property was confiscated for the USSR. By the mid-1930s, some 285,000 families out of a population of almost 1 million had been deported from Ukraine. Thus, as of 1931, more than 70% of Ukrainians' agricultural sector had been forcibly collectivized. Predictably, the farmers did not like this policy, and it became a big problem. After all, up to 85% of the total population of Ukraine at the time were farmers. In 1930 alone, there were 4,098 documented mass peasant protests in Ukraine against collectivization and the Soviet Union. In 1932, 56% of all anti-Soviet protests took place in the Ukrainian SSR. Moscow found a creative way to suppress anti-Soviet sentiment: the Holodomor. The Soviet government set impossible grain procurement quotas for collective farms. When the farmers couldn't meet them, the government simply took away all the grain, even what was meant for next year's sowing. It doomed all following procurement quotas from the outset. Then came the black board system. Farms that fell short faced heavy fines, up to 15 times the monthly procurement rate. Troops cordoned off blacklisted villages, forbidding any trade, food supplies and contact with the outside world. As the number of blacklisted villages grew, they eventually formed entire districts and regions. The peasants needed passports to travel to the city, but they weren't issued. They were denied the right to correspond. Anyone who tried to leave the village without permission risked being shot. Farmers who couldn't meet impossible grain quotas were fined in kind. The authorities confiscated meat, potatoes, lard, and even cereals. Moreover, they mercilessly cut down all peasants' orchards. Predictably, the confiscation of food didn't solve the grain shortage. Instead, it condemned the peasants to starvation. These systematic actions by the Soviet authorities clearly indicate a deliberate and methodical campaign to exterminate the Ukrainian peasantry, later named the Holodomor. Today, 32 countries recognize the Holodomor as a genocide of the Ukrainian people. After 90 years, Russia, as a direct heir to Soviet policy, is still using access to food as a weapon. What is Russia doing today? Looting grain from the occupied territories of Ukraine, bombing Ukraine's agricultural infrastructure, including silos and fields, blocking grain exports by sea and land. As a consequence of Russia's actions, countries in the global south that depend on Ukrainian grain could face a looming threat of an artificially induced famine. Like his predecessors, Putin has weaponized food in his global conflict. This time, however, we must ensure that evil does not prevail.